theyeshiva.net.
Bruchim haboyim, shalom aleichem to one and all. Mazel tov to all of the Messiahim of Mesechta Shabbos in the coming days. Many months of learning this Mesechta and covering Kuf Nun Zayin Dafim from Daf Beis through Daf Kuf Nun Zayin. And this coming Sunday night, Monday, Chof Menachem Av, right? Tesvav to Zayin. Am I right? Today was Tesvav. Chof Menachem Av Tovshin Pei is the grand Siyum of Masechta Shabbos. Mazel tov to all the Messiahim. Mazel tov to all of the spouses who empowered the Messiahim. Mazel tov to all of the future Messiahim. Mazel tov to all the Maschilim of Mesechta Erevin. And Mazel tov to all of Klal Yisrael, because the Simchas HaTorah, Sisu v'Simcha b'Simchas HaTorah, Avidne Yom Tov L'Rabbanan is a Yom Tov for all B'nai Torah and for all of the Jewish people. So congratulations and Mazel tov. This evening, we are going to learn a deep Hadran on Mesechta Shabbos, one which will actually capture some fundamental ideas that pervade Mesechta Shabbos, including what I would call capturing somewhat of the Neshama, the soul of Mesechta Shabbos, if we can use that word, that expression. Tonight we will focus primarily on the Halachic aspects of the Hadran of Mesechta Shabbos, what we would call the Chelek HaNigla, Halacha, Lomdes, Pilpul. Be'ezer Hashem, tomorrow evening, Thursday, 9 p.m., we will resume the Shiur and continue to focus on the element of Drush, Machshava, Hashkafa, Musar, Chassidus, Kabbalah, of the Siyum and the beginning and the Teuchen of Mesechta Shabbos and its applications to our practical, emotional, psychological, and spiritual daily lives. This Hadran of Mesechta Shabbos was presented by the Lubavitcher Rebbe many years ago. The Rebbe traditionally, from my memories, would make approximately 5 or 6 siyumim, public siyumim during the year. Private siyumim I don't know about, but 5 or 6 siyumim throughout the year, which he would do at the Fabrengen, and then delve into a long, complex, intricate, usually brilliant, incredible Hadran, both Al Pinigla and Al Pinister in the siyum of the Mesechta, Bavli and Yerushalmi. Often the Rebbe would also make a siyum on the whole Shas. This siyum of Mesechta Shabbos, the Lubavitcher Rebbe presented, it was Shabbos Shlach, Tovshin Chav Beis, summer 1962. And there was a shiur that used to take place in 770 of Jews. It wasn't a big shiur, it was a small shiur, Mesechta Shabbos, elderly Jews. And it was a continuous, ongoing shiur, and they finished the Mesechta. And the Rebbe said Shabbos at the Fabrengen, and he says, Ich bin schuldig, I'm in debt of a siyum on Shabbos, and he presented the siyum on Mesechta Shabbos that we're going to learn. It was published later in Lekutei Sichos, volume 14, Parshas V'Eschanon, which is the Parsha does Linimine, the Parsha we're coming from, which of course includes Shabbos as one of the Aseres HaDibros. The Sicha, this shiur of the Rebbe, I didn't count, but from a superficial perspective, as I was looking at it, it seems to me that it contains 400 or maybe 500 or more references to Svarim, Rishonim and Acharonim, on all of the sugyas of Mesechta Shabbos that he addresses in this Hadran. Let's begin. We're going to learn the Mishna and the Gemara, but first we have to have a few introductions. And I'm going to ask you to tune into these introductions, because if you don't really understand these introductions, it's extremely difficult to understand the whole siyum of Mesechta Shabbos, the Mishna and the Gemara. So it's important always to have the foundations in place. In the meantime, you can also open your source sheets. If you go to the yeshiva.net, you'll see siyum on Shabbos number 1, Hadran on Shabbos number 1. It's featured on top of the video. On the right, there's a blue icon. It says source sheets. Or if you want to download a PDF, below the video on the left, scroll down below the video, go down the page a little bit, and you'll see on the left it says PDF. And you can open it up, download it on your computer, or print it out. Or if you have a Lekutei Sichos, you can open up volume 14, Parshas V'Eschanon. But please open up your source sheets, because I put in some images which will make the understanding of the Siyum of Shabbos more accessible. Introduction number 1. Among the 39 Melachos that are forbidden on Shabbos, and hopefully if you're holding at the end of Shabbos, you remember what the 39 forbidden Melachos are. One of them is, of course, Boina. We're not allowed to build. Min HaTorah, that includes only a permanent structure. What about a temporary structure? That's a rabbinic prohibition. So the Rabbanan, I'm not allowed to create a permanent structure, even a temporary structure. And that includes even an oil aray, which means a temporary tent. Let's say I have a frame, I have a few sticks standing, and I want to spread out a mat. It's a nice protection. That's I'm going to take it apart. I don't need it permanently. It's a temporary tent. I'm not allowed to do it. However, the halach is, it's a machlekes Rebbe Chachamim earlier, daf kuf chavchet, kuf chavav, but the halach is that to add to a temporary tent, I'm allowed to. That means, if I really began rolling out the mat, and it's at least a tefach, a handbreadth spread out, I can continue it. I can't create create a permanent tent or a structure is biblically forbidden. Create a temporary one is rabbinically forbidden. But to add to a temporary tent, I'm adding what's called to an oil aray, that is permissible on Shabbos. Introduction number 2. One of the 39 labors prohibited on Shabbos is called kosher, which means tying a knot. Like all the Melachas, these were labors that were performed when they were constructing and building the Mishkan, and that's where the Chazal derived the structure of the 39 Melachas. More about that later. And one of them is tying. We'll see where tying was in the Mishkan later. Min HaTorah, what does it mean that you're prohibited to make a knot? There's a condition. It has to be a kesher shel kayama. Kesher shel kayama means a permanent, enduring knot. And it's a fascinating halach. It has to be a knot that when I tie it, my mindset is that it should remain there forever. As long as it exists, it exists. What happens if I decide, you know what, I just need it for 3 months, or I need it for 3 years? Min HaTorah, it's not forbidden. It's not a kesher shel kayama. The rabbis prohibited even an impermanent knot. Here itself, there's an argument brought in Shulchan Aruch and Siman Shun Yud Zayin. There's 2 shittas in the Rishonim, and that is how enduring does the knot have to be even rabbinically. One opinion is at least 1 day. If it's longer than 1 day, then midirabanan, I'm not allowed to make this knot, and I'm not allowed to untie the knot, because you're not allowed to untie a knot that you're not allowed to make on Shabbos. You're not allowed to tie, you're not allowed to untie. Kosher matter. So if I make a knot in the morning, and my point is, I want to untie it at night, then even rabbinically it's permissible. And another opinion is that it has to be at least 7 days. If it's more than 7 days, then rabbinically it's prohibited. So again, min HaTorah, the only knot that is prohibited is what? A kesher shel kayam, enduring knot forever. I don't have in mind ever to take it apart. Maybe 1 day I'm going to need it and I'm going to take it apart. Fine. But right now, there's no established timeline when I'm going to take it apart. It's a permanent, fixed knot as far as I'm concerned. It's as timeless as this thing will exist. However, rabbinically, even an impermanent knot, a kesher she'eino shel kayam, is also prohibited to make on Shabbos. And again, there's 2 opinions. Does it have to be longer than 1 day? Does it have to be longer than 7 days? And then it would be rabbinically prohibited. We usually follow the more stringent opinion discussed in Shulchan Aruch Halachic Halachic Shabbos Siman Shin Yud Zayin, in Turin and Shulchan Aruch and in Shulchan Aruch Harav and Mishna Brura, etc. Next, 3rd exhibit. There's something called medida, which means measuring. Biblically, min HaTorah, there's no problem to measure things on Shabbos. I can measure how big my couch is, I can measure how big my pool is, I can measure how big my field is, I can measure how long my counter is, and I can measure how long my bed is, and I can measure anything, whether it's food, whether it's my property. There's no issue. What's the problem of measuring? The rabbis prohibited medida. This is something that the rabbis prohibited, and the reason for that is because it's called uvdin dechayil. Or as the Shulchan Aruch Harav adds in Erechaim Siman Shin Vav, Zilzul Shabbos, which means it's cheapening the spirit, it's denigrating the geist, the zeitgeist, the energy, the atmosphere, the ambiance of Shabbos. It's uvdin dechayil. It's something that we usually do during the week. It's usually associated with weekday mundane work. You know, you measure your house because you want to sell it. You measure or weigh a food because you want to buy it. It's usually associated with weekly mundane activities. And therefore, even though there's no problem of measuring on Shabbos, there's no prohibition biblically, the rabbi said you're not allowed to make measurements on Shabbos. Okay, now I want to change the subject for a moment and give another introduction. When a corpse is present in a home, everything that finds itself under the same roof with that mace becomes automatically spiritually impure. And it needs to go through a very intricate process in order to be cleansed from that impurity. So if someone, Chalila, passes away in a house under a roof, anything that's under that roof, which means people, utensils, anything that's susceptible to tumah will automatically become tameh. Not only that, even things that are not in the same room. If the house has another room, but it's all under the same roof, the roof connects the two rooms, there's a bedroom. And the door to the bedroom is open, so the tumah of the corpse travels into that bedroom, even if there's no door, even if there's just an opening, a window or a hole of a certain measurement, of a certain size, and there's a room open, so the tumah travels from this room, even though there's a wall, and the wall should create a partition between the tumah and everything that's in the room. But if there's an opening to the other room, the tumah will travel to every single room in the house as long as there is an opening between the room where the tumah is and the other room that is connected by the same roof. However, there is a critical exception. And that is, let's say, the mace, the corpse, any part of the corpse is under a roof and there's a hole in that roof. There's an opening in that roof. Then the tumah of the mace, so to speak, escapes. It escapes through that opening. And anything that's on top of that opening, if a plane flies over, it'll become tameh. But anything that's not under that opening, the things in the house that are not touching the mace will not become tameh. That saves the other objects or utensils or people or food or drinks in the house from becoming tameh. That opening in the roof can't be a tiny hole. It has to be what's called peseach tefach. It has to be an opening that is the length and the width of a handbreadth. So that means it has to be a tefach, is basically a handbreadth. It can't just be a little tiny opening in the roof. That's not enough. It has to be the length of a tefach, a handbreadth, but that's still not enough. Even if it's narrow, it has to be a tefach by tefach. Tefach in the length and tefach in the width. So if you have a tefach and you have a tefach like this, then you have rescued everything in the house from tumah. Last halacha that I want to share with you, and that's the halacha about a klei cheres. Halacha about a klei cheres, an earthenware vessel. Here on the video you have on the top, here you see a picture of a klei cheres, an earthenware vessel. This is a vessel that's made of mud and straw, and it's molded, and it's baked in the sun or baked in a fiery furnace, and it becomes an earthenware vessel. There's a halacha, and that is the only way it could become tameh is me'aviroi, from its cavity, from its interior space. So for example, if a dead weasel touches the klei cheres right here on its exterior surface, every other vessel, let's say a metal vessel or a wooden vessel, would become tameh. But not an earthenware vessel. But if that dead weasel is suspended inside the klei cheres, look where the arrow is, in the cavity of the klei cheres, even if it doesn't touch the walls, the klei cheres becomes tameh. This is a unique halach of klei cheres in Parshas Shmini. Klei cheres mitame only me'avirei. Okay, I hope you absorbed all of this. Let's now go to the text. Please open up your source sheets or open up a Mesechta Shabbos. We're going to learn the last Mishnah and the last piece of Gemara of Mesechta Shabbos. Let's begin the Mishnah. The last Mishnah of Shabbos, Daf Kuf Nun Zayin Amud Aleph. B'shah toivo mutzlachas mazel tov. Zok the Heilige Mishnah. On Shabbos, you are allowed to seal a window. You're allowed to shutter up a window. You're allowed to measure a rag. You're allowed to measure a mikveh to make sure it has the appropriate amount of water to make it a kosher mikveh. I just told you, you're not allowed to build on Shabbos, you're not allowed to measure on Shabbos. We'll get to that in a moment. Now the Mishnah records a story. And this is the last Mishnah of Mesechta Shabbos. It ends with a story. And here's the story. This is a story that took place in the days of the father of a Tana named Reb Tzadok, and in the days of a Tana named Abba Shaul, the son of Botnis. These are two individuals who were from the great Talmudic sages Tanoim, who lived in Yerushalayim, and they lived at the end of the era of the second Beis Hamikdash, but during the second Beis Hamikdash era. The second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed in the year 70 after the Common Era. They lived a few decades before that in Yerushalayim. Reb Tzadok was, of course, the famous Tana who fasted 40 years because he sensed the Churban is coming. This is his father. And another Tana, Abba Shaul ben Botnis, who the Gemara describes in Mesechta Beitza, how scrupulous he was when it came to honesty and authenticity. His integrity was mamish unparalleled. So this is a story that happens in their days, is, and it's important because the fact that they were part of this story is what gives it its halachic power. What happened? They plugged a window. Ma'ir means a window, which actually means not a window as we call a window, a glass window. A window actually means an opening. Ma'ir means, of course, a source of light, because that's what allows the light to come into a room when there's an opening. Or the window is open. So they plugged a opening, a window, b'tafiach, with an earthenware flask. Tafiach is they took an earthenware flask, like this picture, and they plugged the window. Here you could see a picture. They plugged the window with it. We'll soon see why. V'kashru es hamekida b'gemi. They also took an earthenware vessel and they tied it with a strand of reed grass. Here you have a picture. I wanted to show you what reed grass looks like. It grows quite tall. So they took a reed grass and they tied this earthenware vessel probably to a stick. Okay, so now the earthenware vessel is attached to the top of a stick. Here you have a picture of it. By the way, in your source sheets, I also put in these pictures. Take a look at page 2. You'll see this picture you see. They tied, this guy is holding a stick and he tied the earthenware vessel to the stick. How did he tie it? He took a strand of reed grass. Leida, to know im yesh bagigis peseich tefachim lav. To know if in the barrel, if in the roof upwards on top, if there is an opening of a tefach or not. We're going to explain what this all means because I know it's enigmatic. It doesn't seem to be understandable. It's not. The Gemara is going to explain. I'm just quoting now. Untranslated. And from their words and from their behavior, Rebbe Tzaddik, the father of Rebbe Tzaddik and Abba Shol ben Botnis, we learn 3 halachas. That on Shabbos, you're allowed to shutter, you're allowed to seal a window, you're allowed to measure, and you're allowed to tie. Wow. That's the end of the whole Mesechta Shabbos in Mishnayos. You're allowed to shutter the window on Shabbos, you're allowed to measure, you're allowed to tie. What is this talking about? What happened? So the Gemara now continues. Let's see what the Gemara says. The Gemara tells us the background of the story, because if you don't know the background, you don't understand the Mishnah. Let's continue in the Gemara again. You can look in Mesechta Shabbos or look in your source sheets, the first page. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav, a fascinating and a sad and tragic story. And here is the story. There were 2 homes. This is how Rav explained the Mishnah. There were 2, of course, Rav had a tradition how to explain the Mishnah because his teacher, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, was the editor of the Mishnah and Rav was his student. So Rav knew how to explain and articulate what the Mishnah is talking about. So we have the context and the story to understand what the Mishnah was saying. What happened? There were 2 homes. Between the 2 homes, there was a narrow alley, like a narrow path between the 2 homes. Okay, fine. Sadly, there was somebody who was about to die, and he was lying in that narrow pathway between the 2 homes, okay? But here's the issue. The 2 homes were connected by a roof, and this roof was an overhang over the person who's about to die. What does this mean? This means that when he dies, he's dying under a roof, and this roof is connecting both homes. And one of the homes has an opening. Remember, when someone dies under a roof, everything that's under that roof becomes automatically impure with tumas meis, with the tumah of a corpse. Not only that, if that roof is connecting 2 rooms, or in this case 2 houses, and there's an opening in the wall of the home, so the tumah is now going to penetrate into the home. So if there's a kohen in that house, he and his entire family will become tameh. Any food there will become tameh. Any drinks will become tameh. If they had karbanos, if they had holy offerings in Yerushalayim, they wanted to eat it, it will all become tameh. Everything will have to be burned. If the kohen has truma, holy food, it all becomes tameh. If it's a Yisrael or a Levi, still, all the vessels become tameh. Whatever is susceptible, everything becomes tameh. That means the beds become tameh, the clothes become tameh. We don't live with tumah and tara, so we don't really understand what it means. For us, it's an abstract concept. And as I always tell my Talmidim when we learn about these things, people shut down when they hear tumah and tara because it's like so irrelevant and abstract. So I'm asking you to listen because this is pretty fascinating, and this was part of the essential fabric of Jewish life. It's important if you want to understand who we are and where we come from, you have to understand Tumah and Tara. This was an essential fabric of daily Jewish life in the time of the Beis HaMikdash. Today we still have a little bit of it, but not to that extent. So now everything in the house, all clothes, all foods, all drinks, all utensils, again, all those that are susceptible for Tumah, we're not going to get into all of the details, they all become Tumah. So what happened? Take a look at this picture. Sadly, the people in the house realized that somebody is about to pass away. Obviously, medically, they couldn't do anything to save him. So what they do? They took an earthenware flask. Take a look at this earthenware flask, you see? And they put it into the window. It was on Shabbos. They shutter the window. They plug the window with this earthenware flask. Take a look at this picture. I'm showing you on the video here. You see with the arrow, they take this and they put it into the window. They fill up the hole. So now there's no opening. Now here is how they do it. How they do it. Take a look. The outside of the earthenware vessel that's facing outward is not its cavity. It's not its open side. It's the sealed side. Why? Because in order for a vessel, earthenware, to block the tumah, it can't be susceptible to tumah. You can't block tumah by something that's going to become tameh, because then it's going to transfer the tumah. So if they would have put a metal vessel over there, it wouldn't help. You know why? Because the metal vessel would become tameh from the corpse, because it's under the same roof. And then the metal vessel would transfer the tumah into the house, and everything in the house would become tameh. So what they do, they took a tafiach. They took a klei cheres, a mekidush, they took an earthenware vessel. Remember the earthenware vessel? The earthenware vessel can only become tameh through its cavity, its interior space, not the outside. So now when they take the earthenware vessel and they face this exterior outward, so now the meses tumah travels, hits the klei cheres, bounces back, so to speak, because the klei cheres cannot become tameh. So what happens now? It blocks, it obstructs the tumah, and the window is shuttered. So the whole house remains pure. And that's what happened. You see? They filled up the hole. This is what the Gemara says. They filled up the hole. That's what the Mishna is talking about. So that the house wouldn't be tameh. Okay, now, the person passed away indeed. Now they needed this flask. They needed it. They needed the klei cheres. So the question is, they're not moving the maze. It's Shabbos, it's Muktzah, so they're leaving him there for the day. Are they allowed to take away this keli? And the answer is no! Because if they take it away, the tumah is going straight into the house. But wait. Take a look at the roof that's connecting the two houses, which was like a gigis, a huge barrel that became a roof connecting both houses, and the corpse was right under it. But take a look. There was a hole in it. There was a crack in it. The roof was cracked. Oy, if the roof is cracked above the corpse, so the tumah can escape. But wait, the crack has to be a tefach. It can't just be a tiny hole. It has to be a tefach by a tefach in order for the tumah to escape. How do we know if it's a tefach or not? So they took another vessel, another clay vessel, that was a tefach. It was a tefach. And what did they do? They decided, let's get this through the hole. If it fits through the hole, it means that the crack in the roof is a tefach. And that's why this clay vessel could go through. If it can get through, it gets stuck because the crack is too narrow, then obviously the crack is not wide enough, and then we have to leave the earthenware flask in the window. Because if we take it out, the tumah is going to travel because it can't escape. How do you get an earthenware vessel up into the roof? How do you do that? So they took a stick, take a look at this picture, they took a stick. They took the earthenware vessel, and then they took a strand of reed grass, and they tied the earthenware vessel to the stick. So now it was solidly tied, it won't fall off. And now with the stick, they could lift up the klei cheres and see if it goes through or not. The Gemara doesn't say if it went through or not, but that's what they did in order to measure how big the crack is. Some people interpret it a little bit differently, that they actually didn't take a stick, but they tied the klei cheres to a strand of reed grass, and then, I guess from the roof of the house, they suspended it from the top through the crack to see if it goes down. Again, the same point, they're measuring how large the crack is. That's the story, the end of the story. Says the Mishna, midivreihem. From this story, we learn 3 halachas about Shabbos. This is what's called one vessel kills one. You kill one bird with 3 stones. Well, here, with one story, we covered 3 halachas. We learned 3 things about Shabbos. Number 1, Poikekin. Number 2, Moidedin. Number 3, Kaishrin. The first thing we learned about Shabbos is that you can shutter a window temporarily. You're not allowed to build. You can't build a structure. You're not allowed to build on Shabbos. So how can I insert a window and shutter it and plug it? So if I take a board and I nail it in, or I fix a window permanently, then it's biblically prohibited. I'm adding to a binyan on Shabbos. But here, what am I doing? I'm just taking a flask and I'm just covering it temporarily. And remember, to add to an existing structure and it's only temporary, that you're allowed to according to the Chachamim, not Rebbe, according to the Chachamim. And here we have what the Gemara says earlier, Kuf Chavav, Maiser Rav. The greatest source of halacha is a maisa, a story, something that happened, that they allowed them to shutter the window on Shabbos. They did not protest it. Why? How can you shutter? How can you seal a window on Shabbos? You're building. You're adding to your home. You're plugging your window. The answer is, they're taking a flask. They're putting it there temporarily. That's not going to remain a permanent shutter. They're going to take it away afterwards. It's fine. That's halacha number 1. Halacha number 2, poikekin moidedin. You're allowed to measure on Shabbos. Look, they were measuring the crack in the roof. How are you allowed to measure? They were manipulating. They were trying to figure out if there's a tefach. That's why they picked up the keli to get it through the roof, to get it through the crack. You're allowed to measure on Shabbos. Third, kaishrin. They tied. How did they get the earthenware vessel up in the crack? How'd they do that? The answer is because you could tie. They took the reed grass and they tied it to the vessel, and with that they tie the vessel to the stick with this reed grass, and they could pick it up, or they just tie the vessel to the reed grass and they suspend it through the crack. Poikekin u'moidedin v'kaishrin b'Shabbos. And the Gemara finishes the last piece of Gemara, the last piece, and tells a story. The story we're going to focus on more at a later shiur, not tonight, but the story is that Ula saw Rabbi Bar Rav Huna sitting in a tub of water on Shabbos and measuring the water. And he said, the rabbis only allowed measurements if it's for the purpose of a mitzvah or a purpose of understanding and learning Torah. How can you measure it? And Rabbi Rav Huna explained that he was just keeping himself busy. He wasn't interested in really knowing the sizes. That's the end of the whole Mesechta Shabbos, the Mishna and the Gemara. As the Mefarshim explain, and this is the halacha, when we say you're allowed to shutter on Shabbos, allowed to shutter a window temporarily, it's because it's fine. The Chachamim did not prohibit that. You're allowed to measure only for the sake of a mitzvah. So for example, if I want to measure a mikveh, if it has the appropriate size and amount of water that it's kosher for a mikveh, I can do that on Shabbos. But just to measure my counter, or measure my field, or measure my real estate property, I'm not allowed to do that on Shabbos. What about tying? I'm not allowed to make a knot on Shabbos. Even an impermanent knot, rabbinically, I'm not allowed to make an impermanent knot on Shabbos. However, if it's for the sake of a mitzvah, why were they making the knot here? Because they were trying to figure out a halacha of Tumah and Torah. They were trying to figure out a halacha in Torah. It was for the sake of knowing what the right halacha is, knowing what the mitzvah in this situation is, and therefore they were allowed to measure and they were allowed to make a knot on Shabbos. This is the end of Mesechta Shabbos. Now, it is fascinating that the whole conclusion of the whole Mesechta Shabbos is about Rabbi Bar Rav Huna sitting in a tub of water on Shabbos and measuring the size of the bathtub, measuring it, seeing how large it is, the walls, the water, and Ula confronting him, you're not allowed to do this, it's not a mitzvah, what do you have to do this? And he said, no, I'm sitting here in the bath, I have nothing to do, I need to keep myself busy, so I'm looking here, I'm looking there, it's not significant, it's inconsequential, I'm not interested in the measurements. And that's the whole end of Mesechta Shabbos. What is the meaning of this? Why did the Gemara, the editors of Talmud Bavli, Rabashi, Ravina, their students, their children, decide that this should be the conclusion of Mesechta Shabbos? We're still going to get to that. But here, in the Lubavitcher Rebbe's Shiur on the Siyum of Shabbos, Hadran of Shabbos, he addresses what seems like a very minuscule diuk, a very small question. But we know in Chazal and in Gemara, every word is quite meticulous and precise. Not quite, but meticulous and precise. So he addresses a fascinating and interesting question. I wonder how many of you, I'm going to tell you the question is on these words, Poikekin u'moidedin v'kaishrin b'Shabbos, which are the last words of Mishnah Shabbos. What would be the question? think about it, what would be the question? The question would be, okay, take a look at the picture. What happened first? What happened first in the story? Let's see, what happened first? Poikekin or Maididin or Kaishrin? They shuttered the window, they measured, or they tied. Let's see the order. The first thing they did was, before he died, they shuttered the window, right? So that's Poikekin, that was the first thing. What was the next thing they did? Maididin or Kaishrin? The next thing they did was Kaishrin, right? Not Maididin. Kaishrin is, they tied the earthenware vessel to a strand of reed. They tied it to a strand of reed, or with a strand of reed. They tied it to the stick. So that was the second thing. What's the third thing they did? They lifted up the stick, take a look at the picture, to get the vessel, the earthenware vessel, through the crack. Moidedin, to measure if it's a tefach. So what should have been the order in Mishnayos? Poikekin, the Kaishrin, or Moidedin b'Shabbos, because that's how the story happened. First they shuttered, then they tied, and then they measured. That's not what the Mishnah says. Poikekin, or Moidedin v'Kaishrin b'Shabbos. So you'll say, what's the difference? Why? When the Chazal are describing a story in a specific order. Take a look at the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Pakaku es amar b'tafiyach. They plugged the window with a vessel, with a earthenware flask. V'kashru es hamedida begemi. And then they tied the earthenware vessel to a stick with reed. That's the second thing. Now the third thing, in order to measure and figure out if there's a tefach or not. So the Mishnah clearly told us the story. So the Mishnah should finish. But no, the Mishnah changes the order in the halacha. Why? Especially when you look at the Gemara, what happens right after the explanation of this story? What does he go into? He goes into a story of measurements. Of Ula seeing Rabbi Bar Avuna measuring the bathtub. That means that the sequence would have been much more logical, according to the story, Paikekin, Kaishrin, and Moidedin, and then you finish with Moidedin, and now you go to the next story, which is about Medida. But that's not what happens. The Mishnah finishes with Kaishrin, that's the last thing, and then the Gemara goes back to Medida, which anyway happened at the end. Something is strange here. How do we understand this? Now, it seems at the surface that it's a little diuk. It's not so significant. But as I said, every word in Chazal, especially in Mishnayos, the Rambam says, is Loshen Ktsara, v'koilel inyanim rabim. Every word in Mishnayos is so meticulous and precise. And that's why we see how many pages of the Gemara are dedicated just to figure out one word of Mishnah, an extra word. Why did he have to say it this way? He could have said it this way. Certainly, when he changes the story a line later and he puts it in a different order, you have to understand the meaning of this. And as we shall see, from the Rebbe's perspective, this little change of order is not little at all. It actually opens up a vista. It opens up a portal to understand some fundamental gedorim and yesodis in Mesechta Shabbos, including the siyum of the Mesechta. If I may give a little analogy for this, Zois HaTorah Adam, we compare the Torah to a human being and the human being to the Torah. When it comes to DNA, we know today that one cell, one invisible cell, when you get to the nucleus of that cell and you can discover its genome, the genetic code at the core, at the nucleus of that cell, that tiny, minuscule formation and sequences of DNA letters actually conveys and captures and personifies and mirrors the entire living organism. You never say, oh, it's a tiny little cell, what can it tell me? The tiny, Zois HaTorah Adam, a detail in the order of Mishnayos can tell you some of the fundamental ideas that encompass the whole organism, the whole Torah, the whole Mesechta Shabbos. Because klal and prat in Yiddishkeit are very deeply connected. Klal or prat or klal. We go from the klal, we go to the prat, and from the prat you come back to the klal, and every prat in a way captures the whole klal. Now, at first glance, you can give the following answer. You know why Poikekin says first? Not because that was the order of the story. No, Chazal don't care about that so much. It's because Poikekin is the biggest chiddush here. What's the bigger chiddush that you're allowed to do on Shabbos? Measuring, tying, or shuttering a window. The first chiddush, the greatest novelty, is poikekin. You know why? Because as Tosfos writes, on Daf Kuf Chavava Mid Beis, there's a Tosfos there, and that's the halacha. You're allowed to shutter a window even if it's not for a mitzvah. Because Tosfos says, it is so similar to adding to a structure that if the Chazal allowed it, it means they always allowed it. Because this is something that's so daima lebinyan. You push it filling up your window. It's like you're putting in a window. You're putting a board into your window. You're allowed to do that on Shabbos? It's so similar to construction. And yet the Chazal said, you're allowed to do it. So Tosfos says, even if it's not for a mitzvah, if they allowed such a thing, they always allowed it. Because if they wouldn't allow it in regular cases, because it's so much like a structure, they wouldn't even allow it for a mitzvah. So that's the bigger chiddush here. So maybe that's why we start off with Poikekin. And there's a Tosfos in Maseches Kiddushin, the beginning of Perek HaIsh Mekadesh. The Mishna says HaIsh Mekadesh boy ubishluchai, daf memal of Kiddushin. So the Gemara asks a question, why did it say boy ubishluchai? Hashta bishluchai boy mi boya. If you tell me that a person is allowed to betroth his wife through a messenger, for sure he can do it himself. So just say, Ha'ish mekadesh bishluchai, for sure he can do it himself. So the Gemara answers, to teach me that mitzvah ba yosem bishluchai, it's better if you do it yourself. You could send a shliach to betroth the woman, but it's better if you do it yourself. So Tosfos asks, in Kiddushin Memalef, what's the question of the Gemara? Maybe you could say that the Gemara is saying, loizu avzu, which means, first I say the simple halacha, Ha'ish mekadesh boy, you could do it yourself, and now I'm going to tell you a bigger chiddush, bishluchai. What's the problem? So Tosfos says, this concept that you say this obvious, and then you say the more novel idea, that's only b'shtei babois, avol b'shtei tevis loy, that's the language of Tosfos. That you could do when it's two separate stanzas, or two separate mishnas, or two separate sentences. But if it's two words, boyu b'shluchai, that principle doesn't make sense. The Atzmas Yosef explains beautifully the logic of Tosfos, that when it's shtei babois, when it's two separate sentences, so you could say each one was taught at a separate occasion, and they contained the integrity of each one. Everyone was self-contained. So therefore, Tosfos is saying, you could say, first they had the simple one, and then they taught the novel one, and once they taught the novel one, they're not going to go and delete a previous Mishna or previous teaching that they had already, so they left it. But when it's two words, right, one right after another, that's Moshe Yosef explains brilliantly, then you certainly knew what the second word is going to be before you wrote the first word, because it's all part of one sentence. It's one word after another word. So here Tosfos says this principle doesn't apply. First you say the chiddush. You don't tell me the obvious, and then you say, and also another one, which is a bigger chiddush. And therefore the Gemara says, why does it say boya b'shlucha? It should only say ish mekadesh b'shlucha. And therefore the Gemara proves from this that mitzvah boya yosim b'shlucha. According to this principle of Tosfos, which the Lubavitcher Rebbe develops at length in the footnotes of this sikha, it would make sense that the Chazal here are not so interested in the chronology of the story, but rather in the halachic ramifications of the story, obviously. So therefore, the first thing they say is Poikekin, because Poikekin is the bigger chiddush, that even if it's not for a mitzvah, you're allowed to shutter a window on Shabbos. Very nice, that's a beautiful insight. However, when it comes to Moedidin and Koshrin, Moedidin doesn't seem to be a bigger chiddush than Koshrin. So why do they do Moedidin before Koshrin? Moedidin and Koshrin are both only allowed b'makom mitzvah. You're only allowed to make measurements on Shabbos if it's for a mitzvah or it's part of Torah learning, and you're only allowed to make a knot on Shabbos if it's for a mitzvah. Both are rabbinic prohibitions that you're only allowed to do in the case of a mitzvah. So Moedidin is not a bigger chiddush than Koshrin. So why don't they already follow the way the story happened? Poikekin, they write first, both because it's the first thing that happened, and it's a bigger chiddush. But once Moedidin and Koshrin, Moedidin is not a bigger chiddush than Koshrin. They're both permitted only b'makom mitzvah. So therefore, Koshrin is a chiddush and Moedidin is a chiddush. So you should say Koshrin before Moedidin, because that's the way the story happened. Furthermore, Moedidin is actually a lesser chiddush than Koshrin, and I'll tell you why. When you tie a knot that's impermanent, it actually looks like a knot that's permanent. An observer won't know the difference. And when you make a permanent knot, it's biblically prohibited. When you make an impermanent knot, it's rabbinically prohibited. Why did the Chachamim prohibit an impermanent knot? Because it looks like a permanent knot. Somebody who's watching, he doesn't know when I make a knot if I'm thinking it should stay there for 3 months or for 3 years or forever. He doesn't know the difference. The two knots seem perfectly similar to each other, identical to each other. So that's why the Chachamim prohibited even an impermanent knot, because it looks like just like a permanent knot. An impermanent knot doesn't mean it's not a good knot. It could be a good knot, a fine knot. It's just impermanent. It's not fixated forever. So the reason they answered an impermanent knot is because it's mamish similar to a permanent knot. What about measuring? Measuring is not similar to any melacha. It's not involving any melacha. The reason they did it is because it's a mundane act, because it denigrates the spirit of Shabbos. So where is there a bigger chiddush that it should be mutter to do it on Shabbos for a mitzvah? Koshrin or moededin? Koshrin is a much bigger chiddush, because koshrin has an element that mamish is similar to a melacha min ha-Torah. The difference is the timeline in your mind. So the Chachamim answered this because it looks like this. But Medida, they didn't answer because it looks like a Melacha min ha-Torah. There's no Melacha of measuring on Shabbos. The reason they did it is because they felt that it's not in the spirit of Shabbos. So it's included in the Tishbois. Fine. So where's there a bigger chiddush that you're allowed to do it on Shabbos for a mitzvah? Koshrin is a bigger chiddush. So if so, the order should have been Poikekin, V'Koshrin, and Moededim b'Shabbos for two reasons. Number one, because that's the way the story happened. First they shuttered the window, then they tied the vessel to the stick, and then they measured the crack. That's first of all. And second of all, mitzad halachic ramifications, the bigger chiddush is poikekin, the next bigger chiddush is koshrin, and finally the third chiddush is moededin. So the order should have been poikekin, v'koshrin, and moededin b'Shabbos. And I added that also mitzad the hemshech of the Gemara continues to discuss medida, so certainly it would have been geschmack to finish off with medida and then continue with the story of Ula and Abaravuna when it comes to medida. Let's start with explanation. And here, I'm going to ask you to open up the text of the Sikha. If you're opening up your source sheet, so scroll down a little bit. You have to go quite a few pages. I think we can take away the picture now, right? Okay, let's go back here. We can go back to the picture. We can go back to a regular view. And open the text of the Sikha, please. I will open it as well. And I'm going to ask you after the question. We are going to start with the explanation. Siv Beis. You see? Look at the Sichas V'Eschanan. We're going to Siv Beis. After all the questions about Poikekin, Moededim, V'Koshrin. V'Yuvan calls a Bahakdim, Masha Shaninu, B'Tchilas Mesechta Shabbos, Shemalecha Seitzah, Eina Asuda Medoiraisa, L'Boyfen, Shamoitzi, Oisa, Akida V'Anocha. Avo ba'akida bilvad b'loy hanoche ba'anoche b'loy akida eina asuda ki medivrei sofrim. V'yadua hakushal ze lama lo teyasim edoiraisa gam akida levad. Oy hanoche levad mitam chatzi shiur shu osim min ha-Torah gam b'malachas Shabbos. In order to understand all of this, we have to go back to the beginning of Mesechta Shabbos. The end of Mesechta Shabbos is about building and tying and measuring. That's the end of Melacha Shabbos, the end of Mesechta Shabbos. What's the beginning of Mesechta Shabbos? The beginning of Mesechta Shabbos speaks about the prohibition of carrying on Shabbos. We all know one of the Lamates Melachas on Shabbos is you're not allowed to pick something up from a private domain and bring it out and put it down in a public domain, or conversely. As the opening Mishna of Mesechta Shabbos makes clear, the only way it's prohibited min ha-Torah is if you do an akira and a hanacha. If you do an akira without a hanacha or hanacha without an akira, it's only rabbinically prohibited. It's not asur min ha-Torah. What does it mean to make an akira and a hanacha? Akira means to pick something up, to take it away, to uproot it from where it is now. Hanacha means to put it down. So let's say I pick up a football from my house, and I take the football, and I go outside into a Reshus HaRabim, a public domain, and I put it down there. That is the Melacha of carrying on Shabbos. Or conversely, I take the football from the public domain, I bring it into my house, I put it down there, that's the Melacha of Shabbos. What happens if this scenario? I pick up a challah from my house. So I did an akira, I picked it up, the challah was on my kitchen table, I picked up the challah, so I did an akira, okay? Now, if I would walk out of my house and go into a Reshus HaRabim, to a public domain, and stay there, or put it down over there, that's a hanacha. Fine. But I didn't do that. I picked up the challah, so it's on the way. I made a departure. Departure I did, but I didn't do arrival. Meaning, I take the challah, I stretched out my hand outside, and there's a poor man waiting there. He wants to be fed. What did the first Mishnah of Mesechta Shabbos, everybody remembers? Parshat balabayis tesyadei lechutz v'notalani mitoicha. The poor man now takes the challah from my hand, and he puts it down. I did the akira, he did the hanacha. Or the other way around. The poor man takes a basket, right? He picks it up from the public domain. So he did an akira. But he doesn't come into my domain and stand there or put it down. Rather, he takes this basket, he picked it up from the public domain, he stretches his hand into my house, and I come and I take it from him and I put the basket down on my counter and I fill it up with challah and I pass it back to him. So he did the akira, I did the hanacha. Min ha-Torah, you're allowed to. This is not called carrying. Why? Because an akira without a hanacha or hanacha without an akira, min ha-Torah is not called carrying. You're allowed to do it. The Rabbanan asered akira and hanacha, even if you do only one of them. It's only rabbinically prohibited. That's one of the major themes in the opening of Mesechta Shabbos. I hope it's clear. Now, here is a big question. It's a big question it's a well-known question in Achronim. As he brings in the footnotes, the Stei Chemed gathers all the Achronim that discuss it. There's a famous shtickle from this, he brings in the footnotes, Toitzos Chaim of Rebbe Menachem Zembe. Rebbe Menachem Zembe was one of the Go'inei Hador. He lived in Warsaw in Poland, and he was killed in the Warsaw ghetto, April 1943, Pesach. Menachem Zembe was one of the extraordinary Go'inim of the last generation right before the World War, and was murdered then in 43 as one of his farms called Toitzoyes Chayim. Mesechta Shabbos, there he discusses it at length. The Sefer Chelkas Yoyev by Rabbi YY Jacobson Weingarten was a Talmud of the Avnei Nezer, the rabbi of Kinsk in Poland. He was also one of the Go'inim in Poland known as the Chelkas Yoyev. His name was Rabbi Yoyev. Rabbi YY Jacobson Weingarten. He passed away, I think, in 1922 or 1923, the early 20s, also before the Second World War. And many other acharonim, both in the world of Poland and Galicia and the Litvischer world, Litvischer Rosh Yeshivas. A lot of acharonim discussed this in their Shiurim on Masechta Shabbos. And they ask a basic question. Why is hanocha without akira and akira without hanocha not asem in HaTorah because of Chatzi Shiur? What is Chatzi Shiur? Chatzi Shiur means the half measurement. Let's give an example. I'm not allowed to eat blood. What's the shear of eating a kazayas, the volume of an olive? What if I eat a half an olive? What if I eat blood and I consume only a half a shear of blood? Or let's say chametz on Pesach. I eat a crumb of bread. Am I allowed to do that? I'm not eating a piece of bread, a kazayas of bread, the volume of an olive. I'm not doing that. I'm just taking a few little crumbs of bread, of a bagel, of a pizza, and I eat it on Pesach. Am I allowed to do it? Min ha-Torah, that's not eating. Eating is kazayas. That's the only way you get a penalty. What about pig, swine? What about horse meat or anything today? Fat, blood, chaylev, non-kosher meat. I eat a little piece of meat. I don't even eat a kazayas. Am I allowed to do that or not? Machlokes in Mesechta Yuma and Dalar, I think Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan. Chatzi Shiur, asur min ha-Torah. A half a shear is prohibited biblically. There's no penalty. A person won't get lashes because there's no shear. But a chatzi shear is asur min ha-Torah. You're not allowed to consume even a half a shear min ha-Torah. And the same is true, at least according to Rashi and many Rishonim, when it comes to Shabbos. For example, writing on Shabbos is prohibited min ha-Torah. How much? There's a shear, 2 letters. Aleph Beis, or Beis Gimel, or Shin Mem. What happens if I write 1 letter? I take a pen on Shabbos, chas v'shalom, and I write 1 letter. Am I allowed to do that? I'm not allowed to do that. Chatzi Shiur, asur min ha-Torah. I'm not going to have to bring a carbon chatas. There's no penalty, but I'm not allowed to do it on Shabbos. On Shabbos, you're not allowed to take a scissor and cut your hair, right? Geizes. You're not allowed to cut your hair. Biblically, it's a isur min ha-Torah. How many? 2 strands of hair. What if I take a scissor and I cut 1 strand of hair? It's called chatzi shiur. Am I allowed to do it? Min ha-Torah, I'm not allowed to do it. There won't be penalties, there won't be consequences, but it's also min ha-Torah. This is a chatzi shiur. Another example. I'm not allowed to carry on Shabbos, right? But there's a shear. It has to be the size of a fig. What if I take a cholent bean? You know the size of a cholent bean? I take a cholent bean, I pick it up from my counter, and I go out to the public domain, and I put it down over there. I just stand there. Am I chayiv? Do I have to bring a carbon chatos? Is there a skill? No. Why? It's a chatzi shear. Wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. It's called a half a shear, which means part of the shear you did, but you're still not allowed to do it. Ask the acharayim a question. When I carry on Shabbos and I only make an akira and I don't make a hanocha, why do we say min ha-Torah it's mutter? Only with the rabbanon it's asur. Why shouldn't it be asur mitam chatzi shear? It's true. I didn't do the full melacha. I didn't do the full shear of the melacha, meaning I didn't pick it up and bring it out and put it down. But l'chayda, I did a half a shear of the melacha, Just like when I cut one strand of hair, or when I write one letter, or when I take out a half a kazayas, or when I eat a half a kazayas, or when I take out a cholent bean, or when I eat a half a kazayas. I didn't eat the whole kazayas, but I ate part of it, and doing part of an isser is also asr. Because the isser is made up of parts, right? Chazilitz teruf, as Rebbe says in the end of Yuma. An isser is made of parts. 50% is not 100%, but it's 50%. A cholent bean is not an olive, but it's a certain percentage of an olive. An olive is made up of the size of a lot of cholent beans. One strand of hair is not two strands of hair, but it's 50%. 50% is part of 100%. So if 100% is absolutely forbidden, 50% is also forbidden in Torah. Okay, an akira is 50%. I didn't do 100%, that's true. I picked up the object, I put my hand outside, right? I did an akira. You take it from me and you do the hanacha. I did 50%, you did 50%. We should both be usher to do that. Min HaTorah, we don't say that. Min HaTorah is completely mutter. What's the Havana? So Rabbi Nachum Zembe, Hashem Yinkim Dameh, articulates this beautifully as well as in other svarim. Let's see how he articulates this. Umevura b'yishuv hadavar. The explanation is, al pi adiyuk ba'adgoshes haloshen dahai klal legufa. Ha-isu min ha-Torah hu dafke b'chatzi shir. Hainu shechaser rak b'shir. Kamus ha-isur v'loi b'muhusay v'eichusay. Aval im ha-chisarnu b'muhusay isur loi asr ha-Torah. V'cheinu b'nidin didan. Sha'akira ha'enocha levada harein chatzi melacha. V'loi chatzi shir. Chatzi be'echos v'gidrei u'muhus p'ulas ha'itza. L'chein eina asura min ha-Torah. Beautiful, beautiful definition. There's a difference between Chatzi Shir and Chatzi Melacha. Don't confuse the two. What's the difference? Chatzi Shir means I did the whole Melacha. What's missing is quantity of the Melacha. When I take a scissor and I cut one strand of hair, I did the whole Melacha. I cut hair. I took the scissor and I cut the hair. What's missing is there was not enough of the quantity that's required. I take out a cholent bean, I take it out of my house, I put it down on a public domain, I did the whole melacha. The tsuras ha-melacha is here, it's not a half a melacha. The shiur of the melacha is missing. It's 50%, it's not 100%. In other words, the size, there's something missing in the size, in the quantity, in the measurement. A cholent bean instead of a fig. One hair instead of two strands of hair. I wrote one letter, I did the whole melacha of ksiva. I wrote a letter. I took a pen and I placed the ink on the paper, on the parchment, and I wrote a letter. That's a melacha. That's a full melacha. What's missing is the shear, the measurement, the quantity. When I do an akira without a hanacha, it's not a chatzi shear, it's a chatzi melacha. I did not do the melacha. It's not I did the whole melacha, but the shear is missing. The very tsuras ha-melacha is lacking. The eichos ha-melacha, it's not just a problem in the quantity of the melacha, it's a problem in the quality of the melacha. I did not achieve the melacha. So that's not asim min ha-Torah. An example. Departure without arrival, okay? I say I'm traveling from New York to Yerushalayim. No, Alavai, we should be able to, Bekarev. I'm traveling from New York to Yerushalayim. So I tell you, I'm in Yerushalayim. We already departed. We departed from JFK Airport. That's an akira, right? The plane took, you'll forgive my example. We like to be a little descriptive. The plane took off, so there was a departure, there was an akira. But, so you'll say, you're missing a shiur of the melacha. There was no arrival, the plane didn't land. The plane didn't land, you don't have the melacha of Eitzah. The mahus of Eitzah is missing. The teichen of Eitzah didn't happen. Eitzah means taking out something from one domain to another domain. Here, I did departure, but there was no arrival. When I write one letter, the whole melacha was done. It's just the Torah wants two letters. For whatever reason, there's a reason the Torah wants two letters, not one letter. There's a reason because of the krushim. There's a reason you need two hairs, not one hair. There's a reason that a cholent bean is not enough. But the whole melacha happened. There was departure and arrival. I took out the cholent bean and I put it down. I picked it up and I put it down. Here, the plane took off, it never arrived. There was no haitzah. It's not that there's missing a shear. Mashal, I arrived, but my suitcase didn't arrive. Or somebody who was traveling with me didn't arrive. So you could say, I was hoping two people are going to come. Only one person came. But this person came. There was departure and there was arrival. Here, there's an akira without anocha without an akira. You're not missing the shiur of the melacha. You're missing the muhus of the melacha. The melacha never happened. It's half of the it's not 50% of the measurement of the halacha. It's 50% of the melacha. It's 50% of the melacha. The toichen ha-melacha never materialized. Therefore, min ha-Torah, it's not an isser. Only midirabbanan. That's the difference between chatzi shiur and chatzi melacha. That's why he uses the words kamus and echos. Chatzi shiur, what's missing is the quantity of the isser. When I eat blood, even if I eat a little blood, I eat a little pig meat, I eat a little horse meat, I eat a crumb of chametz on Pesach. Whatever it is that I'm eating, something that's usser, I ate blood. The blood went into my mouth and I consumed it. I ate the chazer, the davar acher, it went into my mouth and I consumed it. What's missing is the shear of it, the quantity of the meat. I don't have a kazayis, I have less than a kazayis. But here, the chisaron is not in the quantity of the isser. The chisaron is in the muhus of the isser. The chisaron is in the very experience, in the very essence, in the very tzura of the melacha. It's a chatzi melacha, it's not a chatzi shiur. And therefore, it's mutar ben ha-Torah, which is a very clear and logical distinction. I should just say, as he points out in the footnote 16, that chatzi shiur by Shabbos is not so pashut. Rashi holds that there's chatzi shiur by Shabbos. The Meiri holds that there's chatzi shiur by Shabbos. The Goy Sashri holds that there's chatzi shiur by Shabbos. The Rambam, it seems, doesn't hold that there's a din of chatzi shiur by Shabbos. So we're discussing this according to the Rishonim, Rashi, etc., that there is chatzi shiur by Shabbos, and you're not allowed to do a chatzi shiur on Shabbos. Still, akira without anocha without akira is not aser. Why? Because it's not a chatzi shiur. What is it? It's a chatzi melacha. Ich bin nicht angekommen. Ich bin avek, ich bin nicht angekommen. I departed, I never arrived. Now, if this is the case, let's think for a moment about tying knots. If I tie a knot for 3 months, I take a knot, I make a knot, I tie something for 3 months. Min ha-Torah, it's fine. I'm allowed to do it. The Rabbanan said I'm not allowed to. Why am I not allowed to? It's very similar to a permanent knot, right? The rabbi said, okay, it's not forever, but it's still 3 months. So they said it's usher. Why shouldn't it be usher min ha-Torah? Because of chatzi shiur. Same question. I didn't do the full shiur of the knot. I didn't have in mind that I want this knot to stay here forever. I only wanted to be here for 3 years, for 3 months, for 3 weeks. Zol zayin. But it's a chatzi shiur. Just like when I write one letter. Okay, I didn't write the full 2 letters, but I wrote 1 letter. So 50% I did. So why don't we say that an impermanent knot should be asur min ha-Torah as chatzi shiur? Even if I taka didn't have a kesher shel kayama in mind, so it's not a full shiur, but it should be a chatzi shiur. We say that's not the case. Min ha-Torah, you could make an impermanent knot. What's the reason for this? So the Havana here is because let's see. Via Shloima. Shal derech zo gam benegei l'kshida. The l'cha'oira gam b'kesher sheinu shel kayama hainu k'shechase b'siyum b'shleimus shel melechas hakshira ma'isa uman v'nei sheinu koisher al das yishar kein kol zman she'efshel eliyas kayam yesh lahakshus lama lo yiyasim min ha-Torah mitam chatzi shiur. Even if I make a kesher that's not permanent. In other words, I didn't get to the end of it. I didn't get to the completion of it. I didn't finish it off because I didn't have in mind that it should be permanent. Okay. But it should still be asur min ha-Torah as a chatzi shiur. The answer is, v'atiritzu al derech hanal. Ein ze chatzi shiur b'kamusa shel ha-melacha. Ki im chatzi melacha. Chaser be'echos v'gidrei u'muhusa shel ha-melacha. Ki adas sheyishar kein la'olam hu chelik me'echuso me'gidrei ha-melacha u'bilada chaser be'geder ha-melacha v'lechein ein asur min ha-Torah. The answer is exactly the same way. The same answer that the Menachem Zembe and other Acharonim give about chatzi melacha and chatzi shiur, you can apply also to making a knot. Why? If it's not a permanent knot, it's not a chatzi shiur. It's a chatzi melacha. Meaning, It's not that I did the melacha, I'm just missing something in the quantity of what I did. No, the tzura of the melacha never happened. Why did the tzura of the melacha never happen? Because just like akira without hanocha, I'm not missing in the quantity. It's a cholent bean, it's not a fig. It's a cholent bean, it's not an egg. No, the tzura of melacha never happened. I departed, I didn't arrive. I picked it up from my kitchen table. That's not Eitzah. You don't have the inyan of Eitzah is not here. The tzura of Eitzah is not here. Eitzah never happened. It's not you're missing in the quantity. You're missing in numbers. You're not missing in numbers. The eichus is not here. The teichen is not here. The muhus HaMelacha is not here. You didn't transfer something from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRab. My problem is not measurements. My problem is the Melacha never happened. You started something that's part of a Melacha. The plane took off. That's the beginning. You can't arrive if you don't take off. But taking off doesn't mean you came to Eretz Yisrael. It means you left the airport. There's no Anocha. Got it. A knot, if it's not a permanent knot, it's not pshat, it's a Chatzi Shiur. It's not the Melacha. The Melacha is a fixed knot. The Melacha is a kesher shel kayama. That's the Melacha. If I don't do it, what's missing is the tzuras hamalacha. The very teichen hamalacha never happened, because what's the teichen of the malacha? That this knot is going to be eternal. Eternal, obviously, relative to human experiences and human possibility and human circumstances. You'll tell me, no, I had in mind it should exist for 3 months, so that's a Chatzi Shiur. Min HaTorah, you needed to exist for many years, and I did 3 months. So 3 months is Chatzi Shiur. It's like a cholent bean. That's not the pshat. Kesher shel kayama min HaTorah doesn't mean 3 months versus 6 months, 3 months versus 30 years, 3 months versus 190 years. That's not pshat kesher. Kesher shel kayama is not a question of time. It's a question of eternity. It's a kesher that from your perspective, you want it to be permanent. And unless something happens later, you on your own are not going to change it. Later you may regret it and change it. We don't have an issue with that. It's still a kesher shel kayama, because right now, what's my machshava? My machshava is a kesher that never gets changed. I don't want there should be a shinui in it. I don't want there should be a geder mechudesh in it. Nothing should be transformed in it. It's not a question of time. You say, I thought about it for 1 month, and you have 2 months, and you have 3 months, and you have many more months. No, it's a different type of malacha. If I made a knot only for 1 year, I'm not missing the quantity of the malacha. I'm missing the very tzura of the malacha. The very tzura of the Melacha is not here. Just like by Akira and Anacha. An Akira without an Anacha, I'm not missing in the quantity. The tzura of the Melacha is not here. Why? Because Melecha's Eitzah means you have to take it out and put it down. Melecha's Kshira means that it's a permanent knot. That is Melecha's Kshira, min HaTorah. The rabbi said there's Kshira. That's also not permanent, but that's only midrabanan. So you'll say, min HaTorah, you did Chatzi Shiur. You didn't do Chatzi Shiur, you didn't do the Melacha. You didn't begin to do the whole Melacha. Yes, you made a physical knot. That's true. Just like you made an akira. But that's not the Melacha. The Melacha is a kesher nitzchi. The Melacha is a kesher that's not changeable. It's not a question of time. This is 10 months and this is 20 months. If min HaTorah would be 20 months, and midrabanan would be 10 months, so you'll say it's a Chatzi Shiur. That's not what happened. If it's for 3 months, if it's for 10 months, you didn't do the Melacha. It's not that Melacha. It's a different inyan. You made a physical knot, but the Melacha is a kesher shel kayama. The Melacha is that you want a kesher nitzchi, you want an eternal kesher, a timeless kesher, a permanent kesher. In your mind, as the language of the expression of Shulchan Aruch Harav and Siman Shin Yud Zayin Sif Aleph, based on the Rishonim, that the definition of Shesher Gamaz al das sheyishar kein la'olam. That's the Melacha. That's the Melacha. Now, if you're missing that, even if you say, I want it for 15 years, a knot for 15 years is pretty good. That's not the Melacha. The Melacha is not, you want a knot for 50 years. The Melacha is, you want it to be permanent, never change. That's Melacha from min HaTorah. That you didn't do. It's not, you did part of it, you did not do that Melacha. Yes, just like Akira, the Akira is the beginning of a Hanacha, Hanacha is the end of an Akira, obviously it's connected, you made a knot, you did something very similar, but you're missing the very tzuras hamalacha. Why? Because the time element is the definition of the malacha min HaTorah. So therefore, just like akira without hanacha is mutar min HaTorah, hanacha without akira is mutar min HaTorah, a kesher that's not a kesher shel kayama is mutar min HaTorah, even if you have in mind that it should be semi-permanent, but after a certain amount of time you want to untie it because you know that this string you're going to need for something in a month or a week or in 3 weeks or in 3 months, it's mutter min ha-Torah. If this is the case though, we are now confronted by a major problem. And that is, and here we come to the end of the Mesechta, why is it that the Chachamim became so lenient when it came to knots, and they said that if it's for a mitzvah, you're allowed to make an impermanent knot on Shabbos. And yet Akira and Hanocha, they never gave any exemptions, even for a mitzvah. How do we know? Take the first Mishna of Shabbos. What's the first Mishna of Shabbos? There's a poor man and a rich man, a balabayas inside and a poor man outside. Why did the Mishnah give this story about a poor man and a balabayas? Why can't you just say 2 people? One person is inside, one person is outside, and the person inside gives the food to the person outside. Why does the Mishnah talk about the scenario of a balabayas and an ani? So the Meiri says, and the Bartanura says, and the Achroinim explains this, some Sefer about this, Sfasemis about it, the Shabbos Shalmi about it. A lot of Svarim discuss this, but it already begins from the Meiri and the Rebbeinu Avadi Bartanura on Shabbos. There's a big chiddush here. Tzedakah is a mitzvah. Here's a poor man who wants to eat. This is a mitzvah of tzedakah. It's a mitzvah min ha-Torah. A poor man comes and asks you for food. You're doing a mitzvah. You would think, for a mitzvah, the rabbis would say, no problem, do an akira without a hanacha, do an hanacha without an akira. It's for a mitzvah. After all, that's what happened by tying. They allowed them to tie a clay cheres with a strand of reed. It's not a permanent kesher. That's why, by the way, they used a strand of reed. Why they use reed? 2 reasons. Rashi explains, it's animal fodder. Because it's animal fodder, it's precious. You don't want to waste it. So you're not going to leave it there permanently because you need food for the animal. Remember, food was scarce. If you have food for your animal, you want to have it. So therefore, when you tie the earthenware vessel with reed to a stick, we know it's not permanent because you're going to want to give it to your animal. So at some point, after the mace is gone, you're going to remove it and you're going to use the reed for something else. It's impermanent. There's another reason. The reed at some point is going to dry up. It's going to decompose and wither away. So this knot is not going to be permanent. So therefore, even if you tried, it can't be a permanent knot. So it's an impermanent knot. So it's only prohibited rabbinically. So the rabbis allowed you to do it for the sake of a mitzvah, for the sake of establishing a halacha. Why? Because here they had to know if there's tumah or not, for the sake of understanding what's the right way to behave according to halacha. And then you're allowed to make a knot on Shabbos if it's impermanent. So that asks the Lubavitcher Rebbe, I don't understand. By akira and anocha, it's a chatzi melacha, it's not a chatzi shiur, it's mutter min ha-Torah, it's only asur b'derabbanan, and yet, even for a mitzvah of tzedakah, mamish a mitzvah saseh, and a mitzvah loisik, the ani comes to you and says, I'm hungry. You're doing a mitzvah. So amachaya, do an akira without anocha. Take the challah, put it in the basket, stretch out your hand. So you picked it up from your kitchen table, stretch out your hand to outside. You didn't put it down. Let the poor man take it from you, and he'll put it down. He'll eat it in Rishus HaRabim. Wonderful. Gavaldik, amachaya. You did an akira without a hanachim and atayra, there was no problem. And the rabbis say, I know we have an issue with this, but for a mitzvah we're allowing you to do it. And yet, but they don't do that. And that's why the Mishnah gives the scenario of a poor man and a balabayas. When it comes to the end of the Mesechta, when it comes to tying knots, everything changes. It's a chatzi melacha, and min ha-Torah it's mutter, and therefore the rabbis say, even midirabbanan, it's also mutter if it's for the sake of a mitzvah. Why this distinction? If you'll tell me that Haitzah and Achnasa, Akira Nanicha is a Chatzi Shiur, it's Asur min ha-Torah, I understand, but it's not. It's only Asur midirabbanan min ha-Torah. Akira without Anacha, Anacha without Akira is not the Melacha. It's a Chatzi Melacha. You started to do the things that will make it into a Melacha, but you didn't do the Melacha yet. You're missing the Tzuras HaMelacha as explained. We explained by Shiur is exactly the same thing. That's why an impermanent kasher is only asur midirabbanan. Why is it mutter min ha-Torah? Because it's not a chatzi shiur, it's a chatzi melacha. If you don't make a permanent kasher, you didn't do the musig of kshira. You're missing the tzura of a kasher. The tzura of a kasher in Torah is what? Permanent. Kasher shel kayama. Zolzai. So it's mutter. So the rabbi said it's asur. And here, they compromise. They negate on their issue. They say, nish geferlich. If it's from mitzvah, we suspend it. Now the truth is, you might say, famous Tosfos in Mesechta Shabbos Daf Chav Gimel, Tosfos in Chulin Kuf Daled, Tosfos Nidel Lamed Gimel. It's brought all in footnote 26. Tosfos says, when it comes to different gzeres on Shabbos, it's very hard to compare one to another. Tosfos says, Shema ein lahashvos gzeres shel chachamim zu lezu oisum she'ena b'melacha achas. When you have gzeres and different melachas, Tosfos says, when you're going to start making comparison, you're going to come up with questions. You can't compare. You have to know that chacham had a certain cheshbon, one melacha they made a gzeira, another melacha they didn't make a gzeira. So it could be by Yitzah and Achnasa. When it came to carrying, they said here, the gzeira is always, we're never changing, even for a mitzvah. By kshira, we're taking away the gzeira. When it comes to tzedakah, when it comes to a mitzvah, we're taking it away. And Tosfos says that it's very hard to use the same logic and use it as a pervading thread through all the melachas. However, when it comes to this situation, it's actually the other way around. There's a problem here, there's a contradiction, because if they left this prohibition by Haikira and Anacha, they certainly should have done it by Kshira, and I'll tell you why. What does it take for an Akira to evolve into an Isim in HaTorah? What does it take for a Hanacha to evolve into an Isim in HaTorah? What has to happen? If I pick up the challah from my kitchen table and I stretch out my hand, I didn't do an Isim in HaTorah. What does it take for me to do an Isim in HaTorah? I have to do another action. I have to go outside, or I have to take it and put it down outside. I have to do another action. Still, the Chachamim said, even though you have to do another action, we will prohibit doing the first action, even if it's for a mitzvah. What about by an impermanent knot? What has to happen to turn it into a min HaTorah from a midrabanan? The answer is no action at all. Just a change of thought. The moment I say, you know what? I don't want it for 3 months. I just want it to be there for good. It becomes an Isam in HaTorah. You see the difference? For Akira or Hanacha to devolve into an Isam in HaTorah, you have to do another Pu'ula, another action. Either to do a Hanacha after an Akira, or before your Hanacha to do an Akira. But when it comes to a Kesher She'ein Shel Kayama, all you're missing is the Das. It's only a Kavanah and a Machshava. So here we have a serious problem. If by Akira and Hanacha, where the Isam Midirabbanan will not develop into an Isam in HaTorah unless you do another action. And still the Chachamim said, we are afraid that if we allow an Akira, you could come to an Hanach. If we allow an Hanach, you could come to do an Akira before the Hanach. And even if it's for the sake of a mitzvah, we will never ever allow this to happen. Even an Akira without an Hanach without an Akira, even though it takes an action afterwards to make it prohibited min HaTorah, certainly by Kshira, where the transformation from a rabbinic Isser to a Torah Isser is only an issue of thought. The moment I just think that I want this to be permanent, becomes an Isser in a Torah, for sure, the rabbis should have not allowed you to make an impermanent knot, even if it's for the sake of a mitzvah. Madach, it's a kal v'chomer, madach by Akira and Anocha. They would never allow you to do one of them, even though it's only an Isser Midrabbanan, even if it's for the sake of a mitzvah. You want to feed the poor man, bring him home. You can't give him the food outside, even if it's only an Akira. Why? Because a mitzvah is not enough to cancel out this Isser Midrabbanan, because it can bring you to an Isser Min HaTorah, even though you have to do an action to come to the Isser Min HaTorah. Certainly by Kshira, where you don't have to do an action to make it an Isser Min HaTorah. All you have to do is a little firing of a neuron, a thought. It's a nice knot, we're leaving it, and it becomes an Isser Min HaTorah. Isn't that a tremendous concern? And they should therefore prohibit it, even b'makom mitzvah? L'chayra, strong question, a big question. To clarify it a bit more, if you open up a Rambam, Hilchos Shabbos, Perek Chof Aleph, the Rambam tells us that the Torah says Tishbos, and the Chachamim therefore included in the word Tishbos even things that are not prohibited min HaTorah, but the Chachamim here were given a mandate by Moshe Rabbeinu from Hashem that Shabbos has to be a day of rest, and therefore they included various prohibitions that are not biblically prohibited but rabbinically prohibited. And then the Rambam says they include 2 types of malachas, of midrabanan. One is things that if you do them, they will bring you to an Isser Min HaTorah. They may bring you to an Isser Min HaTorah. And the other category are things that will not bring you to an Isser Min HaTorah, but they look like an Isser Min HaTorah. And throughout the next 3 chapters, the Rambam distinguishes between these 2 types of Isurim D'Rabbanan. One is an Isser D'Rabbanan because if we allow you to do this, you may come to do an Isser Min HaTorah. For example, Akira and Hanacha. If I allow you to do an akira on Shabbos, I'm going to stretch out my hand with a challah. And what will I do? Maybe I'll forget, or maybe I won't realize, or I'll make a mistake and I'll put it down. So the Chachamim said no akira. That's one category. And then the Rambam says another category. Not because it's going to bring you to an Issa min HaTorah, but because it looks like an Issa min HaTorah. And therefore they decided that the Shabbos restrictions should include and encompass these things too, because it looks like an Issa min HaTorah. Like the Rambam says, it's doimel Issa min HaTorah. This is what the Rambam says. And he says it's two separate categories. One category is Gzeira Shema Yavimen Isser Skila. Gzeira Shema Yavimen Isser, that's one category. And another category is Asru Chachamim Neishehin Doimim LeMelachas, because it's similar to Melachas Shabbos. Now you might say even the second one is because it's similar, you may come to do the second one from the first one. But then why does the Rambam say it's two separate categories? It's all the same category. From this you're going to come to the other one. The Rambam says clearly it's two separate categories. Why? Because it's two different types of malachas. One is Asa D'Rabbanan because it can bring you to an Issa min HaTorah. The other one is Asa D'Rabbanan not because it can bring you an Issa min HaTorah. It's not going to bring you to Issa min HaTorah. They weren't worried about that. But it looks like something that's Asa min HaTorah. And because it looks like something that's Asa min HaTorah, therefore the Chachamim included that in the malachas that are Asur on Shabbos. A very different definition. That's what the Rambam clarifies, and it's interesting. People don't always realize this, but when you learn through the Rambam, the Prakim, he distinguishes different Isurim the Rabbanan if it falls into the first category or it falls into the next category. If so, it seems that this is the difference between Akira Hanacha and Kshira. Akira and Hanacha, as Rashi says clearly, the reason is they were afraid it's going to bring you to an Issa min HaTorah. If that's the case, we understand why they couldn't allow you to do it b'mkai mitzvah. Because even if you're going to do a mitzvah, what does it help? When the Rabbanan said you're not allowed to do something because it may bring you to an Issa min HaTorah, what's the pshat? The pshat is that it's be'etzem HaTorah de ke'isser. It's be'etzem ha'chshash d'oraisa. The Torah allows you to do it, but the Rabbanan are basically building a fence so they don't fall into the ditch. So it's be'etzem ha'chshash min HaTorah. The Rabbanan are saying, don't do this, because if you do this, you could come to an Issa min HaTorah. So even if it's for the sake of a mitzvah, the rabbis are not going to be materit. For the sake of a mitzvah, you're allowed to fall prey to an Issa min HaTorah. If this can really cause you to come to an Issa min HaTorah, for example, Chacham said you have to check chametz the night before Pesach, called bdikas chametz. So Taisa says, why can you be mevatel chametz? He says, Shema Yavai Lachli, you may come to eat it. If it's a serious situation that you may come to eat this, so then they're not going to allow you to leave chametz around for any reason. So therefore, they're not going to allow you to do this melacha of akira or hanacha for a mitzvah. If it's going to bring you, chas v'shalom, if it couldn't bring you to an issa min HaTorah, so there's no exceptions. But if the only reason that they asered it was not because it could bring you to a min HaTorah, it's because the Rabbanan themselves asered it because they expanded Shabbos to things that look like Melechas Shabbos. So now, hey mamru, they could say, okay, in the case of a mitzvah, we're not going to give this issur. That would explain a beautiful distinction. By Akira and Hanacha, they were afraid that it's going to bring you to an Issa min HaTorah. So the Chashash is a Torah dikah. So why would a mitzvah change that? Because I'm doing a mitzvah, therefore, it's not going to become Issa min HaTorah. I'm not going to do an Issa min HaTorah. I may come to do an Issa min HaTorah. How can they allow me to do it? Masha'inkin, if it's only because it's doimet to an Issa min HaTorah, so be'etzim it's an Issa d'Rabbanan. They expanded the definition of Shvisa on Shabbos, that it should include also things that are similar to min HaTorah, not because they're afraid that I'm going to come to do an Issa min HaTorah, because if that would be the case, the Rambam wouldn't say it's two categories. It's all the same category. You're going to come to an Issa skilla. He says clearly there's two categories. They expanded the definition of Shabbos. If that's the case, they could say, you know what? In a case of a mitzvah, we're going back and we're telling you could do this. Very geschmack. By Kshira, the vart is, it looks like an Issa min HaTorah. Kesher she'einu shel kayama reflects a kesher shel kayama. They're very similar. So the Chachamim said, don't do this because it looks like this. In the case of a mitzvah, we let you do it. By Akira and Hanacha, it's not that it looks like Haitzah. It's because it's going to bring you to a full Haitzah. Here the Chachamim didn't allow you to do it, even by Mekai mitzvah. Very geschmack, beautiful. But this only makes the question much stronger. Why were they not afraid that by Kshira, She'einu shel kayama, you're going to come to a kasher shel kayama? Fakert, I would be afraid there much more than by Akira and Hanacha. Because by Akira and Hanacha, as I said, you have to do a second action. Here you don't have to do a second action. You just have to have a thought for a moment that you want it to be permanent. And Chasal said the Pesach, you are over them in Torah. So ma doch akira and anocha, they had a chashash, it's going to bring you to an Isser skilla for sure by Kshira. Sheini shel kayama, they should have had a chashash, it's going to bring you to a kasha shel kayama. If we allow a Jew to make an impermanent knot, even for the sake of a mitzvah, what's going to happen? He can come to make a permanent knot just by shifting his thoughts. So how can we allow a Jew to do an impermanent knot, even for the sake of a mitzvah? You're telling me the reason they prohibited an impermanent knot is not because it's going to bring you to a permanent knot. It's only because it's similar to a permanent knot, and that's why for the sake of a mitzvah, they don't mind. Why weren't they worried that it's going to bring you to a permanent knot, just like they were worried by Akira and Hanacha? What is it? Why taka? When it comes to Melacha Sakshira, which is not Shel Kayama, it's a Chatzi Melacha, we explain. It's not a Chatzi Shir, it's a Chatzi Melacha. So just like by Akira, which is a Chatzi Melacha, they were worried it's going to bring to a full Melacha, which is a Hanacha. Here, why were they not worried? And therefore, it's Mutter L'Tzarech Mitzvah, as we see at the end of the Mesechta. So we're left here with a big challenge, with a big problem, with a big question. So I'm going to leave you with one thought, and I want you to think about this. I want you to think what would be the answer to this question. I'm going to leave you with one thought to plant a seed, and then we're going to, Be'ezer Hashem, complete the answer tomorrow's Shiur, which is Thursday, 9 o'clock p.m. at the yeshiva.net. We're going to complete the answer and go to the Nista part. But here's the point, and I want you to think about this, okay? Let's say, I'm asking now, I'm shifting channels, I'm going through a different realm completely, not halacha, not lamdas, but just I want you to think about this question. If somebody gets married and they tell their spouse, I want to marry you, and we want to be a couple, and we want to be connected, and we want to be one, for 10 years. That's what we want. We want to be married for 10 years. After 10 years, we separate, we get divorced. But for 10 years, we are a complete and absolute husband and wife with a full relationship like any other husband and wife. Absolutely no difference. All the chiyuvim of the ksuva, every element of the relationship is perfect and absolute and unwavering. The commitment is there for 10 years in an absolute way. But right after 10 years, boom. You hear my question? So now I want to ask you, how would you define this marriage for the first 10 years when they're married? How would you define the marriage? Is it like every other marriage? It's just after 10 years it's going to change? Or it's very different than every other marriage? And what's the difference? Or if I can give another example. Somebody has a child, and the child begins to grow up, and they tell the child, when we gave birth to you, we decided that we're going to keep you as our child for 10 years. For 10 years, you are our child. But after 10 years, we disown you. Now you figure out your life. We'll take care of you. We'll set you up somewhere. But you're not our child anymore. But for the first 10 years, you're mamish our child. What would you say about those first 10 years when this child is raised by its parents? Are they the same 10 years like by any other child? After 10 years, there's a difference. But those 10 years, it's the same. Or maybe those 10 years are also very different. And what's the difference? Those are the two questions I want to ask you about relationships. Think about it, reflect on it, and if you think well about it, you'll begin to discover the halachic answer. This is an answer in halacha, in lamdas, that the Lubavitcher Rebbe is going to suggest to understand Meleches Kshirim in Torah versus Meleches Haitzah, which will explain the difference between the beginning of the Mesechta, which is not allowed b'makam mitzvah, akira or hanacha, and the end of the Mesechta, kshira, which paikikin amaydadim v'kaisher b'Shabbos, which is allowed b'makam mitzvah, which will then allow us to understand clearly the order of the Mishna, paikikin, and then maydadin, and then kaishrin, as we will explore Be'ezer Hashem in tomorrow's Shiur, part 2 of the Hadran of Masechta Shabbos, tomorrow night, 9 o'clock p.m. See you then at the yeshiva.net, part 2 of the Hadran. And I say to you once again, Mazel Tov, Sisu v'Simchu, b'Simchas HaTorah of Hadran Allah Masechta Shabbos, Usnu Chavod LaTorah. Thank you. Good night. Those of you who want, you can ask some questions, and I'll take some questions for a few minutes. When you split up the Shiur into 2 parts, is that a definition of Chatzi Shiur? Or a definition of Chatzi Melacha? Git gesagt? Git gesagt. You want to know if it's just a Chatzi Shiur, it's a halbe Shiur, or it's a Chatzi Melacha? I'm afraid that it's a Chatzi Melacha, not a Chatzi Shiur. That's what I'm afraid. It's a ganze Shiur and a Chatzi Melacha, right? Because it's a Shiur, but it's a Chatzi Melacha. Akira without Hanacha and vice versa, it's an incomplete Melacha. Right, it's an incomplete Melacha. Completely. The Melacha never happened. The Tzura of the Melacha never materialized. It's a half a Melacha. You started to do the Melacha, you picked it up, but you didn't finish the Melacha. Chatzi Shiur means you did the whole Melacha. It's just you're missing in the quantity of the Melacha, but the Tzira of the Melacha is there. Why did the Chachamim aser Hanacha without Akira? You're not going to make another Akira after the Hanacha. That's a good question. You understand why they aser Akira, because from an Akira you can make a Hanacha, but once you're making a Hanacha, you're not going to make another Akira. That's a good question. So if you look in footnote 22, he brings from Shulchan Aruch Harav Siman Shin Mem Zayin, the reason that Chachamim aser Akira on Hanacha is Gzeira Shema Yavoyu Kol Echad Ve'echad Mehem Lasses Melacha Shleima B'Shabbos. It's a Gzeira that every one of them may come to do a full Melacha on Shabbos. This is Shulchan Aruch Harav Shin Mem Zayin, based on Rashi, Shabbos, Daf Beis Amud Aleph. But the Balatanya added one word, mehem. Rashi doesn't have the word mehem. You see? Look in the Balatanya's words. Gzeira Shema Yavoyu Kol Echad Ve'echad Mehem Lasas Melacha Shleima B'Shabbos. Rashi took out the word mehem. Rashi doesn't have the word mehem. Shulchan Aruch Harav added the word mehem. Why? So the Rebbe suggests via Shlomo shekavanas admur hazaken lahadgish shegzeiru zu v'hachshasha higam al misha oisa ha'anocha belvad v'hagzeiri shelo yavai hu atzmai lasas malacha shleima b'pam beis. The Shulchan Aruch Harav is emphasizing here that the gzeira is not only on the one who made the akira that he might make the hanocha. The gzeira is also on the one who only made the hanacha. What's the gzeira? He's not going to make an akira, he did the hanacha only. The gzeira is that he himself shouldn't come to do a complete melacha a second time. In other words, if you allow him to do a hanacha now, even though he didn't do the akira, next Shabbos, he's going to say, oh, I did an hanacha, yeah, I put it down, I'll already do an akira also. So the chash is also for the person who did the hanacha. You're not only worried about the person doing an akira that he may do a hanacha, but you're also worried about the person doing a hanacha, only a hanacha. And the gzeira is what? The gzeira is not only that if you aser an akira, you have to aser an hanacha. The gzeira is tak on the person who did the hanacha. That's why his language is gzeira shema yavoyu kol echad ve'echad mehem lasas malacha shleima b'Shabbos. Mehem. You're worried about both of them. Even the one who's doing a hanacha, you're worried that another time he's going to do an akira. It's not pshat gzeira shema yavoyu kol echad ve'echad lasas malacha shleima b'Shabbos. You're worried that every person is going to come to do a Melacha Shleima b'Shabbos. But rather, and Hanacha is Atu Akira. No, you're also worried about the guy who's doing the Hanacha. That's the pshat. And then he brings the Shaklavatariya of Rashi and Tosfos over there on the Gimel Amud Aleph about Akira and Hanacha. So that's the reason they answered both an Akira and a Hanacha. Next question. Where's the Chiddush of Tosfos that you have to say the Chiddush first? So you look in footnote 7, it's Tosfos Kedushin Daf Mem Aleph, the Berzhana Rav, Reb Shalom Mordechai Shvadron, the famous Maharsham, the Berzhana Rav in his Sefer Divrei Shalom, under the entry Zuvein Tzarech Marzu discusses it at length. Stechema discusses it at length. Look in footnote 7, he gives all the footnotes about that Tosfos to understand why that is the main Chiddush. Okay, we'll stop here. Have a wonderful night, and Be'ezer Hashem will continue Thursday evening, 9 o'clock p.m. sharp at theyeshiva.net. Thank you very, very much. Have a wonderful evening and Mazel Tov.
This class is brought to you by theyeshiva.net. Please help us continue the classes. Make even a small contribution at www.theyeshiva.net/donate.